I have great pleasure in welcoming you all on the occasion of Pandit Bhatkhande Memorial Lectures by Shri Ashok Da Ranade. May I request Shri Arvind Parikh to present a welcome speech. Shri Arvind Parikh.
Dr. Mehta, Dr. Ranade and friends. As you know, this function is organized by Indian Musicological Society, duly supported by NCPA and also with the full cooperation of Music Forum. I was told by Professor Mehta that I should give a welcome speech, and I thought that frankly it's really not necessary, but so a few words about IMS. I was given some details which some of us know, some of us don't. This important musicological society was established way back in 1970, and its registered office is in Professor Deodhar School, but the functional office is in Baroda under his able guidance. The aims and objectives of Indian Musicological Society are to promote study and research in the field of music, to promote writing on music and related arts, and spread appreciation of music in India and overseas. It's very heartening that these days more and more people in an increasing number are taking interest in the research dimension of music. The seminars that we hold from time to time are really very encouraging, and frankly to us it's a pleasant surprise that over 300 people come to attend such seminars right from morning until evening, and not only for one day, sometimes 3 days. So the work which IMS have been doing not only has been very useful in the past, but I would very strongly emphasize that this good work, hard work which has been done in the last 27, 28 years has really borne fruits now, so that people are now increasingly taking interest in the research activities. The focus of the society is on promotion of musicological research in the field of musical styles and forms, schools, gharanas in music, comparative and historical studies, psychology of music, psychomusicological of music, whatever it means, voice culture, physics and acoustics of music, and so on. I think the less I will leave to Ashok. I'm finding it rather difficult even to pronounce certain names. IMS publishes a journal which is having very high scholastic standards, and people who read it, I'm sure, regularly. This journal has been published for the last 20 years and more, and it reaches many university libraries in India and overseas. The journal, is important to mention, is partially subsidized by grants from Sangeet Natak Academy and Gujarat Sangeet Nritya Natya Academy. IMS have also published some 16 books which are very valuable. Today's lectures is a part of a series which, as Professor Mehta described, this I think is the second.
No, this is the fifth one.
Sorry, my fault. Fifth in the series. This is supposed to be a yearly series of discourses on unexplored areas of musicology, relevant to theoretical as well as performance aspects of Indian music, to be delivered by eminent scholars. Ashok Da Ranade is certainly one of them. To introduce Ashok Da Ranade, I think he himself will object, so I will leave the matter at that, because Ashok is far well known to each one of us, every one of us. I can only say that I consider myself very fortunate and privileged to have known him, interacted with him, and learnt many aspects of musicology, as he calls it, from him. May I request you to start, please?
Just I may add a little bit here. The first series of 3 lectures under Pandit Bhatkhande Memorial Lectures were delivered in April 1992 by Dr. Premlata Sharma at Bombay, organized in collaboration with Bharati Vidya Bhavan, Department of Music, Bombay. The topic that time was History of Indian Music, Indian and Western approach to history and its application to music. The second series of 3 lectures, illustrated lectures, were given in October 1993 by late Pandit K.G. Ghende on perception of Pandit Bhatkhande on the study of ragas. These were organized in collaboration with the Department of Music, University of Bombay. The third series of 3 lectures, all illustrated with live demonstration, were delivered in November 1994 by Professor Sumriti Muthatkar, retired professor of music of the Delhi University. The topic was Hindustani Sangeet mein Shastra va Prayog. These were organized in collaboration with the Faculty of Music and Fine Arts of the University of Delhi. The fourth series of 3 lectures were given in 1996 December by Professor R. Satyanarayana at Madras. The topic was Mela Traya, covering Swara Mela, Veena Mela and Rag Mela. We had received collaboration of the Department of Music, University of Madras. And now we have the 5th 1998 Pandit Bhatkhande Memorial Lectures by Dr. Ashok Da Ranade. He is one of the founder members of the Indian Musical Society, along with late Professor B.R. Devdhar, Professor Ansel Lobo, late Sri Vamananda Deshpande, late C.C.P. Godse. And so he is one of the founder members of Indian Musical Society, and now we have the pleasure of having him for the Pandit Bhatkhande lectures. Professor Ranade.
Professor Mehta, Arvind Bhai and friends, we have a chosen audience here, and I can indulge in some high technical stuff, in the sense that I would definitely like to say that when we say musicology today, what is being taught at musicology and what has been discussed as musicological issues raises many problems in my mind, because somehow it seems that we are running in circles, and the original intention of musicologists in India and a modern perception which dawned on us sometime in the beginning of the century has been lost today. It's very symptomatic that the list of topics discussed in earlier lectures, which Professor Mehta read it out to us, sounds like discussing the same problems again and again, as if these are the only problems which can be called musicological. And one of the reasons why I took the subject and gave it a kind of intriguing title was to raise many more problems which I have in mind because of the present tenor and quality of discussion about musicology. I said I would like to term my theme as Towards Indian Musicology. The moment I use the word towards, it definitely means that we have not perhaps arrived at it. We are approaching it. We are approaching towards a position which can be described fruitfully and truthfully as musicological. It also means that I am non-committal. I am saying that I am going to discuss something which today people call musicology. And thirdly, perhaps I feel that discussions which are likely to take place after my presentation might prove conducive to formulation of musicology as it should be in the 20th century. Is the term Indian ambitious? Because I have said Indian musicology. And let me frankly put it to you that no musician, musicologist, scholar of music in India can really hope to call himself an Indian musicologist because he doesn't know enough of Indian music. The plurality of music that we enjoy in India should make us stop and ponder how much Indian music do we know to call ourselves Indian musicologists. It's very obvious that somewhere along the line we have deliberately narrowed the scope of music itself and then have satisfied ourselves by calling us Indian musicologists, that is dealing with Indian music as such. No. Music with which we are dealing is Indian, but what we are dealing with is not Indian music in its totality. A very partial view of total Indian musical reality is available today in our writings, in our discussions, and even in our performance. And that's why I feel that perhaps I don't have a right to talk about Indian musicology. Because firstly, I don't know enough of Indian music, and secondly, I don't know enough of the writings which are musicological and about all these musics put together. When I went back searching for more and more clues about the voice of our own culture about this particular discipline, I found that world over the term musicology has been changing its connotations throughout the history. In fact, it's very interesting to know that the word musicology itself did not find a lexicographic acceptance till 1930s. It's very interesting to note that during that period, that is the early part of the present century, people started founding musicological societies in Europe and Germany. People started floating journals about musicology. People started trying to define the field of musicology, but all that happened so late. That's because somewhere along the line, people felt the necessity of studying the non-performing aspect of music with rigor, sincerity, and thoroughness. But even then, some of the definitions which one can glean through suggest to us that people were not quite clear about what musicology meant to them. They were either overshooting the area or they were understating. And if you really go into the literature which is described as musicological and the definitions of what musicology was meant to be, you will see a big gap, a big yawning gap. For example, one of the early definitions, musicology must include every conceivable discussion of musical topics. Second, the whole body of systematized knowledge about music which results from the application of a scientific method of investigation or research or of philosophical speculation and rational systematization of facts, the process and the development of musical art and to the relation of man in general or even to animals to that art. Definition of musicology. One more. Musicology unites in its domains all the sciences which deal with production, appearance and application of the physical phenomenon called sound. Now you can see that all these definitions put together will give you a picture of musicology which is extremely confusing, extremely varied, and there is no focus whatsoever. What is the Indian picture, the Indian scene? Because as I said, if you go by definitions which are available to us, and if you feel confused, the other way to go about it is to study cultural expressions about this kind of theme. In other words, there are number of cultures which are practicing music for long durations of time. Naturally, all of them must have thought about their own music. Supposing we try to see how each culture has tried to look at the thought of music. I'm not saying musicology, I'm only saying thought. Then perhaps one can get a better picture. And I restricted myself to, as I said, India, and within that really Hindustan. And when I say Hindustan, I am of course referring to the geographical entity. As you know, above Narmada is Hindustan, and Maharashtra is a Madhya Rashtra, so we include ourselves in Hindustan as far as music is concerned. And that's why I said, okay, now how my culture looks at it. How does it define it, if at all, or how does it behave towards thought about music, thinking about music. And then I came across some interesting terms. For example, the first term, which strikes a close parallel to scientific and systematic study, which seem to be the core of all musicological definitions. Scientific and systematic study of music. Then the closest parallel in India has been, of course, Shastra. Now, as a strategy of trying to understand what Indian culture feels and expresses itself about various aspects of culture, I make it a practice to what I described as collecting together the terminological clusters. That means, supposing I am thinking about Shastra as a term, then I try to see in how many ways the term Shastra has been used and what are the connotations of these different terms. I go to the extent of collecting proverbs, etc., etc. I also go to the extent of collecting distortions of the same term in various ways. And that would give you the total picture of that particular term. Now, Shastra, very, very interesting terminological cluster. The first term that you come across, it's a very hurting term in a way, is Shastra Ganda. This is a term used to describe a superficial bookish scholar. Shastra Ganda. You have another term which is Shastra Chakshu. And Shastra Chakshu means grammar. Shastra Chakshu is grammar. So this is also very interesting, that how do you perceive the role of a Shastra? Role of the Shastra here is as if it gives you an eyesight, it gives you an insight into something. And that insight is of course available through grammar. So that's why Shastra Chakshu is given that honor of being called grammar. Then you have of course other Shastra Darshin, Shastra Vid, Shastra Vadaha, Shastra Vyutpatti, Shastra Virod. All these are meaningful terms. Then one also comes across a very interesting terminological tribute which has a lot of history in it. And musicology and history are connected subjects, so in a way I am also hinting at what tomorrow we are going to discuss. Came across a term called Shastra Shilpin. And you would be surprised to know, and you should not be surprised to know in a way, that Shastra Shilpin is the description of Kashmir. Kashmir as a region has been described as Shastra Shilpin because, as you know, the long tradition of theoreticians and thinkers on various aspects of Indian culture, they hail from Kashmir. So this is a terminological tribute to Kashmir, that the Kashmir has been described as Shastra Shilpin. One moves along and we try to see what is the Shastric model. Once again, playing with terminological insights. Very interesting that if you try to understand what a Shastra means, and Shastra says systematic knowledge, okay, who is the Shastrin? One who gives you systematic knowledge, that is also very fine. But there must be a model. Now what is a model? I am raising these questions because somehow I feel that Indian musicological model that we are practicing today is far from the way it was developed earlier. and I'm making a special kind of charge sheet against all of us in a way, all those who will include themselves in the modern period of Indian musicology. And that charge sheet would begin by saying that model is never supposed to be prescriptive. Model is supposed to be a guide. But somewhere along the line, you made that model prescriptive, and that stopped the growth of your musicological vision. And that's why the word model, as I said, has never been defined as a prescriptive standard. It has definitely said that, well, here is a valuation of standard about it, but it never said prescriptive. It has always been a flexible framework which allows you to collect your thoughts, to collect your various activities, and that's why model for everything. And to search for a model is in a way an inquiry into the meaningfulness of Shastric business. If there is anything like a scientific behavior, then that behavior must have in it search for a model. You have to search for a model, because that means it avoids a lot of replication, lot of duplication and unnecessary waste of time. As they say, you don't have to discover Newton again. Newton has done something, so assume him and go ahead. But model allows you to do that, and that's why models are important. The point is, what kind of Shastric model in musicology has been developed in India? This is the problem. Then again, admitting my own limitations, I said, okay, I will concentrate only on Sanskrit words. Though all of us are aware that enough literature is available in regional languages on music, which can be described as musicological. When the printing press, the new university education, nationalism, awareness of what science means, awareness of what our Indian culture is, and awareness of creating a kind of self-image, all this brought together gave us a fillip. And Indians went on writing in regional languages on music, and many of the writers were performing musicians of great repute who were otherwise illiterate in a way. But they yoked themselves to the task of writing on music and came out with extremely transparent, sincere and authoritative books or booklets or monograph, the way you describe them. These I have not touched, simply because I don't know enough languages. I have also not touched upon the literature which was pre-printing days, but the literature is available. So I am trying to tell you that I am only trying to give us a sampler of Indian musical thought as far as musicology is concerned. And the period from 500 BC to 1921, you begin from Naradiya Shiksha and come to Abhinavaraga Manjari by Vishnu Sharma. In this particular span of time, there are 121 major works on Indian musicology. Firstly, I decided to check on the titles themselves, because I feel that names tell you many things. Though Professor Mukherjee has taught me that proper names are arbitrary marks. And still I feel that, well, here are names which tries to suggest to you the thrust of the author's intention, what he wants to include in that particular work and what he wants you to glean from that work. It's very essential that there are points of views which are coterminous, co-orbital. Otherwise you will never get what the author is trying to give you. After all, language is inadequate when you want to tell you something which is very intensely felt. Now look at these titles. Majority of these terms, I have of course made a statistical analysis, but I am bad at arithmetic and it's not necessary also. Most of these works include in the first half of the title the word Sangeet. And then of course what follows is an adjective or a name or a description which tries to tell you that the work is of immense importance, the work has a particular way of saying things. For example, Ashum Sangeet and then follows Chudamani, Ratnakar, Sudhakar, Kalika, Shringarhar, Vidya Vinod, Sar, Upanishad, Sarodhar, Sara Kalika, Chintamani, Amrut, Kalpataru, Suryoday, Sarvasva, Chandrika, Parijat, Sudha, Darpan, Arnav, Chandra, Bhaskar, Sudhanidhi, Sara Sangraha, Makaranda, Pushpanjali, Sarodhar, Kalanidhi, Saramrut, Kaumudi, Kalpadrum, Sarani, Muktavali, Mani Darpanam, Sangraha, Chintamani, Chandroday and Sagar. Now after Sangeet, these many, and all of them has a particular thrust. When anybody says Sangeeta Sarvasva, he is making a claim. When he says that Vidya Vinod, now he is making a claim. As you know, the term Vinod actually needs to be translated as recreation, not as humor. And that's why Manasollas had chapters which are known as Vinod, because they are recreational. And recreation is different from entertainment. And that distinction has been made in the titles. Then, only 7 titles have included author's name in the title itself. Patron's name figures only in 2 works, and very interestingly, they are in the 18th century. I am suggesting to you something, that even though patrons were responsible for the writers to float their works, it was not customary for the authors to pay tribute in the name to the patron till very late in the history. So that suggests to you how the patronage was looked at and what was the function of patronage and how the author looked to the patron. Then there are quite a few titles which refer to specific elements of music like Deshi, Raga, Tala, Bhava, Rasa, Mela, Raga, etc. Some are focusing on Nritya and 1 or 2 are devoted to Mridanga. The point I would like to make is that all these studies of titles, bare titles of these 121 works, during the span of say 500 to, as I said, 1921, suggests to you that Indian musicology has developed an attitude which identified 4 functions as musicological functions. The first function is compilation of authorities. Second function, discussion of scientific issues. And when I say scientific, I am saying Shastrokta. Then manuals, actual practice of the art to be helped. That was one of the, and fourthly, grammar. Now all these terms are in English, but they have parallels, or one should say that corresponding terms, but very specific in their thrust, which we will of course use later on. It's very interesting to note that we have, over all these years, centuries, consistently narrowed down the focus of musicology. If you begin from Bharata and you come to Bhatkhande, from Bharata to Bhatkhande is not just alliteration. It also means that there is a continuity and at the same time lot of change. What was the change? Firstly, we went on defining music as Geetam, Vadyam, Nrityam, but slowly Nritya was taken away. Still more imperceptibly, Vadya was also taken away. And by 1920, when Pandit Bhatkhande held that Lucknow conference, they had to pass a resolution saying that dance and thumri singing should be encouraged in our conferences. So from Ratnakara, where you had a chapter devoted to dance, you come to 1920s where the language of encouraging thumri and dance, giving it a status, was utilized, was used in a major conference which had an all India basis. So that suggests to you how we were cutting down the definition of Sangeeta itself. Why there are very few works on instruments? That's because, once more, the practicing musicians still use that formulation, aphoristic formulation, as you know, Uttam Gana, Madhyam Bajana, Kanishtha Nachana, or Bikat Batana. Now this aphorism again has a wisdom of practitioner's wisdom, but at the same time it suggests to you a hierarchy. And that hierarchy is a direct result of what musicology has been doing. It was cutting away dance, it was cutting away instruments, and slowly but surely by 1930s we started saying that vocal music is the only musical primary expression of India. So musicology went on concerning itself only with vocal music. By and by it paid some attention to other kinds of music, but otherwise they concentrated on vocal music. So the 20th century appears to be the final narrowing down of the scope of musicology in India. We never believed that we want to do history in musicology. I will come back to that later. One more common feature which can be gleaned from these 121 works is that what I describe today, what you will describe today as ethnomusicology, seems to be at the back of the mind of these people. In simple language, ethnomusicology only means that you have to study music and the culture which creates that music together. It only means that music reflects culture and vice versa. It also means that you can't understand a particular culture unless you understand the music produced by that culture and vice versa. So there are elements and elements, but these are the primary considerations for any ethnomusicologist. It in a way says that music is important because music is a part of a total life pattern. By itself, music has no importance. That's what ethnomusicology believes in. And then you come across, as I said, ethnomusicological framework, a beginning of that in all these earlier major musicological works. I mean, I don't have to go into that, but a few examples. In Ratnakara, the first chapter devotes 161 shlokas to deal with the themes of Ishvara, Jiva, Jivotpatti, Garbhotpatti, three basic body humors and various chakras in human body. Only then it begins to talk about music. Because unless you have the world view before you, you can't understand the music which is produced by that culture. And that culture, that particular culture at that particular junction of time believed that these are the things which create our music. So unless you understand them, you won't understand our music. That was the belief. Or you go to Manasollasa, which predates Ratnakara by 100 years. Interestingly, from the same area. It's also interesting that this work, as I said, is a kind of bringing together various authorities, though Someshwar, Somanath, the king itself, is the author. Now he has, as I said, chapters devoted to recreations. He calls them Vinod. Army and its divisions, merits of a king, administration of state, taxation, diamonds and rubies, miracles and medicines, recipes, wines, games, all these have separate chapters, and music has a separate chapter. Vadya, etc., etc. One more kind of clue which makes us say that these people were thinking ethnomusicologically. I have many a time said that if you really want to know Indian music, then you must be aware of 5 categories of musical expression in India. The categories are primitive, folk, religious, art, and popular. Unless you are able to talk about all these 5, you cannot hope to talk about Indian music. Otherwise, you will have a lopsided picture of music, and your theorization will also be equally lopsided. The point is that awareness of these categories shows that you are ethnomusicologically aware. Very interesting, the first major work we talk of always is of course Bharada's Natya Shastra. He clearly says that ragas or melodies with less than 4 notes are not musical, are not to be used. And the next line he had, but Shabara and other clans use this as music. Now this awareness of a different kind of music is very important. Or in Manasollasa, it's very interesting that he is referring to Trivali drum, a particular kind of drum. I am translating. The Trivali drum is used to accompany inebriated professional women's dance. Is this not nightclub music? Is this not popular music? This suggests to you awareness of a category of a different kind of music. As you are all aware, Manasollasa also talks of Gondali Nritya. He calls it Chitra Gondali. That is Gondhal of Maharashtra today. And he says that the king saw performance of this dance in a fair which he therefore liked and said encourage this dance, and he patronized that dance, and that's how Chitra Gondali became a very prestigious kind of dance performance. Point is that this shows awareness of other categories, not only of raga music or classical music in quotation marks. There is another interesting detail here. Someshwara talks of storytelling along with instrumental music. As you know, in 70% of story songs which are bracketed today as folk music, you will have this kind of music presented to you. Here again he shows awareness of that different category of music, and this shows, as I said, ethnomusicological vision. There are many other details, like he is talking about miracles, and we say miracles, that means again divine something. No, he is talking of magic shows. Now I remember that in this very organization, when I suggested that magic is a performing art, people were scandalized. And I said, well, you don't know the essence of performance, that's why you are scandalized. I said acrobatics is a performing art. If you want to inaugurate experimental theatre, I was asked to give a suggestion. I said, well, call a dombari, call a nut, and have a performance outside. That would be the beginning of your experimentation. But as we are only interested in Beijing opera and the acrobatics included there, this was not taken up. But the point is that all these categories exist simultaneously for centuries in India. They reflect on each other, and the totality of this categorical expression makes Indian music. My contention is that musicology has lost sight of this multifaceted musical personality that India has. We have concentrated on 3.5% of musical reality, to use Marathi literary criticism dogma, 3.5% reality. That is the elite literature. So you are talking only of 3.5% and calling yourself Indian musicologist, much left to be desired. Later, I am talking about the model that we had, and as I said, the model has been made by all these efforts put together. Further, I feel that how the treatment given to music can be viewed, how can it be understood easily. You must know how a book is written. You must know how a person thinks about it. You must know how he puts down the thought. There is a kind of modality and specificity about it. Everybody cannot think the same thought and cannot express in a similar manner. There also there is something like individuality. And there I feel that Indian culture, as reflected in Sanskrit scientific literature, has carefully developed certain formats of presenting thoughts. And I am only going to refer to them. First is kosha. Now RC was just discussing that we don't have enough koshas today, obviously because we have left behind the original impulse. From before 500 AD to about 12th century, we have 10 major koshas. And I am only referring to koshas which come near music and performing arts. I am not referring to others at all. Then you have sutra as a way of formulating thoughts, as you know. Then we have vartika, which are commentaries on sutras. Then you have bhashyas. As you know, Gyaneshwari is also a bhashya. I am trying to suggest to you that whatever may be the origin of these formats, the formats were accepted all over in India for every kind of intellectual discussion. And that's why kosha or bhashya or vartika was never confined to sacred literature. You know, we have a kind of hang-up about it. Everything in India relates to religion and goes back to Samaveda. Poor Samavedin. You know, I mean, they never thought that everything will be traced back to them. It's not necessary. Then you come to Nirukti, which is etymology. There are wonderful variations of looking at etymology itself. Of course, later on, people were quite denigrating about etymology because etymology was misused. But we must make distinction between use, abuse and misuse. Anything can be misused. Even democracy can be misused, as you know. So the point is that that doesn't mean democracy is bad. That only means it's a misuse. So Nirukti, etymology has been misused, obviously. But still, I came across a very mocking remark by Voltaire. I'd like to share that with you. Etymology is a science in which vowels count for nothing and consonants for little. Or there is a more balanced statement here by Jespersen, the famous linguistician. Etymology tells us nothing about the things, nor even about the present meaning of a word, but only about the way in which a word has come into existence. The point is that here he is obviously referring to the history part of it. As it happens in a kind of excavated city, you have layers and layers of past civilizations coming up to the present. Similarly, if analyzed properly, etymological analysis will give you layers and layers of meanings which are perhaps used by successive cultures and civilizations. So here is the history part of it, going back to the past for using the past, not only to understand the past. In India, etymology developed very well, and in fact, as I mentioned earlier, there were one or two interesting insights. That one school maintained that everything has to be traced back to the verb root, and that is etymology. So going back to the root is the etymology. Why so? Because there is a philosophical undercurrent here that every word comes into being because there is some action which takes place. As soon as you have an action, the word comes into being. So moment you have an action, there must be a verb to it, because that's the linguistic unit which expresses the action part of it. Just as you know, I mean, the quality of action, you will have adverb. The quality of noun, you have adjective. So the moment you are doing something, you must have a verb. So going back to the verb was defined as etymology. And that's why etymology meant searching for the root, searching for the verb root. A little later is a magical view of etymology which is also found here and is known as Nidanavada. Very interesting, it says that the moment you know the etymology, you know the nature of the thing it refers to, and then you have a control over it. Mind you, having a control over it is the magic part of it. I mean, just as you know, earlier people would say that if I draw a bull, I have a control over that animal. Similarly, if you go back in etymology to the word, you understand it and then you have a control over it. So knowledge is power in a different way here. So etymology, then of course we have Samhita, then Nibandha. Nibandha really meant to bind together, to chain, etc. As you know, Nibandha is also Prabandha, Nibandha, all this has come to musical terminology. Then we had Tika, which has been the most secular format, and that's why you have Tikas on Kalidas and Tikas on Ratnakar. I mean, Tika nowhere was entirely sacred. In fact, all these formats developed to perfection by Sanskrit tradition were taken over by other fields of life. They were never confined to sacred jobs. They were never confined, limited to religious duties. All these were used in all areas of life. And in fact, just as in case of the term Shastra, in Introduction to Indian Culture, I always say that if you want to understand Indian culture, you have to know 4 Shastras. Which are those 4 Shastras? Kama Shastra, Natya Shastra, Yoga Shastra, and Artha Shastra. And that will give you an insight in Indian culture. All these are Shastras, and see the range from Yoga to Artha Shastra. I mean, I don't have to talk about Kautilya's vision, who predated Machiavelli by centuries and had equally cool temperament about ruthlessness of kings and peoples and whatnot. Coming back to all these formats, coming back to the 4 orientations I talked of. Now, how the 4 orientations are utilized? If you remember, I talked of grammar as an orientation, I talked of manual as an orientation, I talked of treatise as an orientation, and compilation of authorities. These are the 4 orientations of Indian musicology. How to arrive at a conclusion that a particular book has this orientation? Because as it happens in case, there are overlaps, and all classifications are really speaking only suggestive. They are not to be taken as God's word and no, thus far and no further, no. Then there are 26 items or dimensions or items on the axis which you can analyze, and then you will know how the work is oriented. Oriented as a manual, oriented as a treatise, oriented as a grammar, or oriented as a compilation. I don't have to go into those details, they will appear later in the paper, but perhaps if you would like to know a bit of it, is title, author, period, authorities, author's region or place, embellishments, merits, demerits. Interestingly, in all these musicological works, demerits outnumber the merits. Always. It's very interesting. Voice qualities, instrumental tone, mention talas, ragas, dance forms, non-art music, non-art instruments, importance of artists as well as audience, benefits, adverse effects of music, prosodic modes, mention of females, professional caste, performance on language and literature, school styles and gharanas, music and color, music and time, etc., etc. There are 26 items on which can suggest to you that the way they are treated would mean that this book is a manual, this book is a treatise, this book is a compilation of authorities or a grammar. Moving ahead, as I said, there are these formats and associated functions. Manuals, for example, which are shikshas, then we have sangrahas, which are compilation of authorities, then we have vyakarana, which is a grammar portion, and of course you have the treatise. My contention is that by and large Indian musicological vision insisted on grammar and grammatical view of music as the musicological vision, and it decided not to have history, decided not to have philosophy, decided not to have aesthetics, not too much of it. There are of course references, but basically it said no, we want to talk about this grammatical portion of it. But of course in India, as you know, the whole tradition of grammarians is a tradition of philosopher grammarians. But in the sense that they will begin with something which has to answer simple question. Again, simplifying a bit, aesthetics would tell you what is relevant and irrelevant. Grammar will tell you what is correct and incorrect. Ethics will tell you what is good and what is not good. And of course, economics will tell you what is profitable and what is not. The point involved is that which are the basic questions we are posing up before ourselves. And questions are of grammatical orientation. And of course, I have dealt with Shiksha's manual aspects. Interestingly, one or two points which are not perhaps covered earlier. Indian musicology also went hand in hand with poetics all the time. Now, this vision was lost later on. We never understood that these two things are combined deliberately. These two things have been brought together because there is certain purpose about it. We didn't believe that. And that's why poetics went out. And if you read modern musicology, beginning from pre-Bhatkhande stage, of course, Bhatkhande was a crystallization of a particular kind of vision that India had. And I will come back to that in my charge sheet, as I say later. But the point is that the manual aspect, as it went on from music to poetics, they struck on a parallels. No musicological work thought it beneath its dignity to talk about how to do a thing. Because how means immediately we think of craftsmanship, and that is below a grantha. Craftsmanship is a manual. No, it's not a guide for SSC students. That's not what we are referring to. It's very interesting that if musicians find in Naradiya Shiksha, for example, or the Pratishakya literature, how to pronounce, when to do it, how to do it, how many times to do it, how to teach it, in what pitch you should do that. I have analyzed Naradiya Shiksha in these 26 parameters, as I said, but this is only a kind of specimen analysis. The point involved here is that this was a common vision in poetics as well as in music, the manual aspect of it. For example, Vamana, 600 AD, he gives you an injunction. Never use the same word twice. Now this is an injunction. You have to follow it while creating poetry. This is something which can be included in a manual. How to do it is very perfectly included, very pithily pointed out. Or again, Kautilya's Arthashastra, as you know, lays down Rajacharya. One of the features of Indian musical vision is that it responds to three cycles. That distinguishes Indian musical vision as well as musical performance. The first cycle is, of course, birth and death. The second is day and night, and the third is seasonal. All the five categories of Indian music seem to respond to these three cycles. And that's why you get a bridge which you build from music to other areas of life. So there is a relationship there. The point is that Arthashastra laying down Rajacharya, Ayurveda laying down Dinacharya and Rutucharya. You come across Rajasekhara in 10th century, product of Maharashtra, talking of Maharashtrian women singing lullabies, etc. He lays down a Kavicharya. And that Kavicharya is so exhaustive and exhausting that if one really follows that, I don't know whether he will become a poet, but he will soon be a person who will be envied for his energy and dynamism. He lays down what to read, when to read, how to practice, how to recite, at that time where you should face, etc., etc. The point is that Abhyasa Pustika, manual, would mean that nothing is left to chance, all the directions are given to you, and the onus of not doing it is on you. If you don't do it, you won't get it. As simple as that. But the question, how should we go about it? Well, you are not allowed to ask that question because everything has been answered. That is the right royal Abhyasa Pustika. And I am saying that this manual aspect was so ingrained in Indian culture that you get it in all areas of life, including music and poetics, etc. Then Sangraha and Vyakarana. Now last point, and then we will be able to discuss. I find that as grammar, Vyakarana was the main format which Indian musicological vision has accepted for expressing itself. Main functions of Vyakarana must be reflected in what musicology does. And it's very interesting that if you go along the list of grammatical functions, you will see them directly reflected in what musicological texts have been doing. So what I am now reading out to you are originally meant for grammar. But as I said, the practice of Indian musicology reflects these. So Indian musicology does not use the same words, that's what I am saying. But the function is parallel. For example, first function, as you know, Vararuchi and Patanjali, both these have identified these functions as functions of grammar. Raksha, preservation. I don't have to tell you how musicology tries to preserve music. Then Uha. Uha means to bring into being new padas, that is individual musical components, to serve as building blocks for further creation. This is what it means. Then you have, of course, Agama, that is you lay down certain standards and people would aspire to that standard, people would deviate from that standard, people will be judged with reference to those standards, and that is Agama. Then you have a Laghuta, very interesting. It says that it is impossible to study and know every authentic musical expression and unit. However, musicological studies provide a way, a shortcut, because they study authenticity as a concept. And it gives you lakshanas of authentic. What is authentic? Following features. So you are able to judge for yourself what is authentic and what is not. It's almost like giving you a theorem. Once you know the theorem, you can solve hundreds of examples. And that's exactly the function of this Laghuta. So Laghuta really means that it gives you, in nutshell, the basic concept which will allow you to move on your own. So you are not going to parrot out. You are not going to just recite. You are going to create. But you must have some standard, some reference point to allow you to move efficiently where it is necessary to move. And that's where Laghuta helps you. Then of course, Asandeha. It removes all the doubts in your mind. Most of the times, as you know, even those who have been in music for years together, many times feel that I don't know whether this is good or bad. I don't know how to proceed about it. There are thousands of times. Musicology tries to help you out in this. Then apabhransha. It tries to tell you what is incorrect use, distorted use, imperfect use, and what is not desirable. It gives you that. That helps you. Then of course, dushta shabda makes possible the knowledge of what is correct and what is not. But as you know, dushta has an ethical connotation. Grammar has been a cornerstone of human thinking because it tries to distinguish between good and bad. It has always a kind of ethical undercurrent, the desirability or undesirability of a particular action, and grammar wants to talk about that too. And that's why this dushta shabda. Then of course artha jnana. What is the total import? You may understand the meaning, but what about the import? The import is wider, but is of course more ambiguous. Ambiguity and contradictions are not the same. We are interested in ambiguities, we are not interested in contradictions. And music wants to create ambiguities and removes contradictions. This is where musicology helps you. And finally, dharma labha. And as you know, this is musical culture intertwined with Indian culture would lead to dharma in a very wide connotation of the term, and it would only mean that which will allow you to sustain yourself and the society into which you belong. That's the only definition of dharma which is applicable to all areas of life. Finally, you have the format of treatises, tattva grantha. Now they are abstract, they are more general, they are challenges to your creativity because you have to do lot of work after understanding them. I don't know how to translate these two terms in English, but in Marathi we say samajne and umajne. Samajne and umajne. You may intellectually understand something, but your mind doesn't get it in, and that's different. Now this is where the tattva granthas come in. They say finally all these are specific instances. You must be able to move above them. And when you move above them, where do you arrive? You arrive at tattva grantha level. And that tattva granthas have some definite strategies which I would detail. This I am pointing out to you because I feel Indian musicology has been misinterpreted in many respects, and one of the respects has been that people have not been able to follow what is the strategy of the writer. What is the intellectual strategy he is following in putting forth his argument? When I discuss the sutras, you will realize what I am arriving at. The first sutra is Lakshanusari Lakshanam. That is, distinguishing characteristics are stated on the basis of the contemporary living tradition. Mind you, these sutras apply to all performing arts. I am not talking of music now. Lakshanusari Lakshanam, as you would know, I mean right from Bhatkhande back to Sharangdev, people have been saying, no, I am talking of Adhuna Prasiddha. What is now current is laying stress on that. Lakshanusari Lakshanam. Then, second sutra is Pradhanyena Vyapadesha Bhavanti. Entities are known or named after the major ones. In a Tattva Grantha, all the details are not mentioned. Many a times our own people who are supposed to be products of this culture read the treatises and say, but this has not been mentioned there. And the treatise wants to tell you that I am mentioning the pradhana, the major ones. Other ones you have to induce. That's your responsibility. Then third one, Yathottaram Muninam Pramanam. The later the sage, nearer he is to that contemporary practice. So what is the latest journal says? Well, this is the answer. The Yathottaram, one who comes later, will talk about the standard which were prevailing at that time. So if you want to quote anybody, you must know at what point the argument was made. Because as you know, arguments germinate because of the totality of circumstance. I will come to the charge sheet, as I said, when I would like to tell you that Indian musicology in its modern avatar became what it is because of certain promptings. So we know that these are the conditions. But if we know them, we must also transcend them. That is the main problem. Yathottaram Muninam Pramanam. Then the fourth strategic sutra is Siddha Paramatanuvad. It says that something has been proved in other branch of science, then I will assume it. I am not going to prove it here. For example, in Sangeet Ratnakara, voice qualities are mentioned in terms of Ayurveda. That means there was a close give and take between these two disciplines at that time. The musicologists understood Ayurveda and vice versa. So no musicologist worth his tradition will try to explain everything that he says in that same book. He will say, I have assumed the other authorities who have already done that work. So if you are curious and suspicious, you go to that. Don't ask me to prove it. But the moment we say this, the modern interpretations get stuck and they say, we don't understand. He doesn't explain what he means by that. He doesn't because he has assumed it. If you know what he has assumed, it's your job to see what are the basis for the assumptions. And that's why Siddha Paramatanuvad is a very important sutra which has been followed by Indian musicology. Then of course there are various sampradayas And overall, Indian musicology, as I said, basically interested in a Vyakarana view of music, and it leaves aside aesthetics, leaves aside history. So the charge that these people don't even mention their biodata cannot be accepted, because that was not their goal. Musicological model excluded history. It wanted to say that. So now finally, now as I said, I am commenting on the shortcomings of modern Indian musicology. We date it conveniently with Pandit Bhatkhande, but all of us are aware, in all the regions where Hindustani music is prevalent, there are pre-Bhatkhande writings of extreme importance, and they need to be placed properly in the history of musicological literature. We have not done justice to all these people. They wrote small booklets, sometimes articles. At that time, what was the dominant form? Essay, as I said. People have written essays. No reviews, but articles and essays, and in magazines and journals, because that was the organ which was keeping people informed. So people used that, didn't write books all the time. So unless you take review of all this literature, you are not in a position to comment on the state of Indian musicology. We have depended too long on, as I said, books, and which were of course printed when the printing press came in. But before that, around that, there is a lot of musicological literature which needs to be attended to. Number one. Despite earlier inclusive stance, Indian musicology seems to have discontinued taking interest in non-elite musical categories. 2. Modern musicology failed to understand that the prime characteristic of musicology is codification. Verbalization and writing down of the musical material rank low on our priority list. This is extremely important. Perhaps during the discussion we will dwell on that. But somewhere along the line we have again failed to understand that codification need not be verbalized all the time, and everything that is verbalized need not be written down also. What is codified, and the practice reflects the codification aspect of it. So if you analyze the practice and performance, you become aware of codification. That's what I am saying. Indian musicology represents a cultural decision to give weightage to the grammatical orientation. Consequently, the model of systematization which emerged has specific features such as hierarchy of multiple criteria, conceptual clarity, terminological precision. The decision to follow physics and biology as more scientific models was uncalled for. As you know, in the early decades of this century, people started saying that to be exact, you have to follow physics. To be exact, you have to follow biology, because Darwin was in fashion. And people were thinking, oh, this is it. If you want to be exact, this is it. I am suggesting to you that grammatical model has its own precision and exactitude, which was fully practiced by Indian musicology till the newly educated arrived on the scene, and they have now not done justice to this other way of looking at musicology. Links with poetics were severed for no apparent reason, or its role in the received musicology was ignored. The matrix of much traditional wisdom in the country has been oral tradition. This was not properly appreciated. While resorting to the newly acquired written tradition, flexibility of the oral tradition was misinterpreted as a lack of scientific attitude. Time lag between scholastic and performing traditions is due to their inherent makeup and natural functions. The former made for stability and the latter for dynamism. Artists and scholars have the joint responsibility to balance these functions. Instead, modern musicologists tended to over-define or over-codify the material with adverse but avoidable consequences. Modern musicology in India stopped raising new questions. Obviously, it failed to take notice of the changing music around. Finally, it is necessary to state that many features of modern musicology owe their origin to the nascent nationalism that may, however, explain its shortcomings but cannot justify it. Whatever Pandit Bhatkhande and contemporaries have done, great links with nationalism which was nascent at that time. But as I said, that only explains the kind of writings that appeared, but do not justify it, because that has failed to do justice to the musical material which is available in India and the performing tradition which has been going on all these years. Thank you, and discussion welcome.
So in a subtle manner, would you agree that it tends to be dogmatic, the approach to Indian music, since it doesn't really welcome too much inquiry, and as you mentioned that they don't want much to be verbalized, and they depend more on the oral tradition. So would you say that, would you apply the word dogmatic to this?
I would apply the word dogmatism when I relate the model business which I talked of, that the models were viewed as prescriptive models, while the musicological models were never intended to be prescriptive. In fact, the musicological texts always give you paradoxical views of reality. For example, even if we decide to talk of raga music, the elite music of it, in Ratnakara or any of these granthas, you will find that it will say the raga would be correctly delineated, means it is avirbhav of the raga. The next moment it says you have to move away from the raga, and that is called tirubhav of raga. So if you sanction deviation, that means you are not dogmatic. And that was sanctioned. But as I said, slowly and surely we started looking at these models as prescriptive models. And that's where, yes, it came in.
When you mention this other approach to musicology, then you are one. So what exactly are you thinking? Is it that the same scientific view which we use for biology and physics?
I would suggest that the grammatical view of musical universe, in the way I have discussed, is a very sound view. I also feel that if we pay attention to the totality of musical reality, our musicology would be healthier. Now we are suffering from a kind of, let me put it that way, anemia, where we are concentrating only on raga music. I have come across people who say, oh, but that is folk music. In fact, all the time I have been insisting that I do not like the word Shastriya Sangeet applied to raga music, because I make a distinction between Shastrokta and Shastriya. Shastriya is that which has rules. Now folk music has rules, so it is Shastriya. What is so different about raga music and folk music? The difference lies in the fact that raga music, you have Shastra Ukta, spelled out. The science is spelled out. In folk music it is not spelled out, but it is very much there. There is a precision. Things are taught, things are learned. They evaluate. They say this is a good performance, this is a bad performance. They teach, as I said. And that's why if we pay attention to all the 5 categories, that is number one. And secondly, as I said, I make a distinction between codification, verbalization and writing down. I feel codification is the first essential part. Verbalization, yes, of course. But if it's not there, I will not say, oh, it's not codified.
So to what do you attribute this elitism of musicology?
Pardon?
In a broader perspective, what do you attribute this elitism of musicology? Is it Brahminical? Is it?
I would say puritanical and not Brahminical, because that's a better word. We became Puritan in so many ways. For example, of course, socio-cultural practices and the British view that helped you. As I've been saying, that if as a musician I feel, for me, music has to be music, number one. Then for what purpose, from whom are the matters. It became exactly the reverse. That is elitism there. That musical quality did not come first. Who is the originator of that music? That became first. And that's why, we have lost so many things as far as Maharashtra is concerned. I said that people feel and people say that Maharashtra is proud because Maharashtra is musical. And I always say that then why have you lost Baithakichi Lavani? Why have you lost all those chandas with their different tunes? How many artists do you really know? How many proverbs do you know? I mean, musicality ultimately does not mean only melody. Proverbs are musical. How many proverbs do you know? In your day-to-day life, how many proverbs can you use? Can you remember proverbs? Why not? Because our definition of musicality, our definition of music has been narrowed down to such an extent that it has become puritanical in the worst sense of the term. It has lost its strength to self-liberate. Musical experience liberates you. We never allow that to happen to us. In the Victorian age, people used to say, oh, a man should not cry. I mean, to be seen to cry, that means, oh, this is unmanly. That's a kind of view. On the other hand, we now feel that, oh no, it's a communication. I don't have to verbalize anything. That becomes Satvik Abhinay for us. That was a wider definition. And that was total communication, which we have cut down.
One small question, if I may. It appears over the years, the academics and actual performance has somehow parted ways. Do you feel, whilst you have prepared a charge sheet, could you also prepare a list of recommendations? What could be done for the future? So that I feel this bifurcation of the Shastra part or the academic part and the actual practice part could be brought nearer each other. The utility of the academics could be translated into actual performing realities.
It seems that one of the strong points of Indian tradition, the earlier musicological tradition, was that all these musicologists were practitioners of music. They themselves were performers. And as you know, Arvind Bhai, all these years I have been saying that every performer should talk about his art, should write on his art. He should not fight shy of that. Even if he might say that, no, I don't know enough language, doesn't matter, because he has the experience. After 4 writings, you will come across something which is truer to the truth of experience. And that's why musicians must follow this tradition of being performers as well as theoreticians of what they do.
But who will teach them their own expression? How will they express themselves? Unless they know the grammar of it.
That's why, finally you come across lot of difficulties today because we are not utilizing all the sources that we have. And the educational system or whatever it is has so compartmentalized things that we forget to understand a term. If I have to understand what happens to this term in theatre, I think it is research. Actually, it's not research. Actually, it is trying to understand what am I doing. And I think terminology, for example. Arvind Bhai would remember that in Music Forum, you wanted to have a workshop for music critics, right? I said, why to have a workshop for critics? Have a workshop for writers on music. Because criticism is a very small part, but actually so many people are trying to write on culture and write on music. So how to do it and why would need a lot of thinking. And there I think, what I am suggesting is that, well, terminology, history, how really to use history. I mean, I have deliberately linked up history to follow musicology because...
I was just hinting at one thing. Do you expect every artist who expresses himself or herself to verbalize his expression?
To an extent, yes.
Expression. He does express himself. He remains an artist. But do you really expect him to verbalize his expression?
It's not impossible.
I think that is asking too much.
Have we ever tried? I have. I will give you an example. I will give you.
Talking of a general category.
No, I mean there is nothing like a general category artist and special category artist. There are artists and artists and artists. And I tell you from my experience, as, how should I put it? It has been my pleasure to question artists all the time.
Since
Plus,
musicologist.
no, that's what I'm not saying. What has happened is that if I am talking to a Lavani singer, I will give you specific examples and then technical terminology. Supposing we are talking of educational techniques, how do you teach, etc., etc. One of the artists from Kutch used to play bonito, which is a bird whistle. It is a kind of a small clay thing with 2 or 3 holes. He blows through one hole, operates on 3 others, and creates a melody of 7 notes or so. Now this bonito goes back to Mohenjo-daro. It's a very old instrument and spread world over. He played that, I recorded him, and I said that, how do you teach your son to do this? He said, no, ye dekhta hai aur bajata hai. So I said, well, of course, it took me half an hour to come to a point where he directly answered my question. मैंने कहा, hook जो है आपकी, the way you blow it is so specific and special that it cannot just come by observing you. There is something in it. Then he said, okay, एक गिलास लाइए, पानी भर के गिलास लाइए. गिलास लाया गया. Straw दीजिए. So it took me some time to understand. He's asking for a straw. So I brought the straw. Then he started blowing into that straw. And then he said, I observe the rate of the bubbles coming up at a particular speed. When it reaches that kind of blowing, he said, now you are ready for that instrument. Now this is educational technique. Now I have to abstract a principle from that. He has taught his son. He has taught his nephew also. He must have done it thousands of times. He has perfected it. Where is the harm if I verbalize him later, but ask him what he has codified? This is the way of going about it. I have done it thousands of times in musicians. How do you tune the instrument? So-called folk instruments. For example, yes, it's very interesting you have brought up a question here, whether they are able to verbalize. All of us are aware of Rajasthan Sarangi players, Manganiyars and Langas and all that, right? Yes. Now, would you say that if these are the terms which they use, would you say that they know what they are playing and they also have terms for that, and that means codification? For example, for the opening movement, pardon that word, but elaboration of a raga, you will say chala. Then that chala might come in 3 different talas. One is called Toisa, which has 6, Teen-tar, which has 7, and Kalwada has 8. All terms received from them, right? Then they also play a lehera. I asked them what is a lehera. Then he said it is a kind of palta. His definition of lehera, a kind of palta. Then I said, what about the raga names of the ragas? Then he say, Surat ka sur, Subh ka sur, Kohari ka sur. So sur is the common term, Kohari ka, Surat ka, etc. So he is distinguishing between all them. Then every raga name will have a story involved to that. When they start singing, they will always sing a duha. While inquiring, talking to them, I realize that wherever they do not have a duha, the raga swarup is very confused. But wherever they have a duha, it is a better codified raga. Because duha includes the story of the raga, sometimes the praise of the raga, as well as what the raga includes. So this is all the Lakshan Git, etc., everything combined into that for them. Then I asked instrumentalists, how do they tune? They had divided the octave in two parts, from Sharja to Pancham and then Pancham onwards. They count the notes that Dadar is the Sa, Agor is the Pancham. Then Joda, 1.5 is the Madhyam. They will call it Joda, 1.5. Then Adhak is a way of looking at the octave where Re को Sa मानकर जब चलना होता है तब ये कहेंगे Adhak. Then दादर से एक रे होता है, इसने सा से एक रे होता है, सा से दो, दादर से दो ग, दादर से तीन म, दादर से चार प. This is another way of describing the octave distribution. Then Agor se ek, Agor se do, Agor se tin. So from Pancham onwards again there is a division of the octave, and it goes on this way. Now what I am saying, that this has not been verbalized by any of us, but they have terms, they describe them, they judge them. What happens now? Where is our musicology? We call them folk musicians and keep aside. So I have hundreds of examples. That's what I am. He himself was saying all this.
He is, from that point of view, he is a musicologist. I will put it that way.
But that only means that a performer...
He is able to explain that.
But that only means that every performer is a nascent or incipient musicologist.
Yes, in a way it is.
Yes, right.
You were talking about the grammar, like you were saying just now that musicology has remained a grammar sort of thing. That is the thing. But you are talking about the primitive folk and all these 5 types of music, as you said. Every dialect will have a different grammar. That's what you are...
No, please, don't fall into linguistics trap. Just because I have said grammar. I am only using the term with, tradition has thrown up. But I would suggest to you that actually what they are doing is codification, that's all. So don't be misled by the term Vyakarana. I will say yes, codification. They have a codification. What are the principles of their codification? They are very much there. Is this musicology?
They have different terminologies according to their own...
Right, fine. So what?
So, no, it will have a different... What I am saying is every type of music, like primitive or folk, will have different sort of musicology.
Yes, it has to be. I mean, why are we thinking of some, homogeneous umbrella of musicology which includes everything in it? That stage might come later. In fact, I have not referred to that, but there is a very strong argument today. People say that we are not ready for musicology, that is theory of music, because we don't know all the musics in the world. So they are not ready to call it theory of music.
You mentioned that after 1921, about 121 musical works exist today. And we see that after 1921, whatever musicological work we read and available is probably not useful for a practicing musician. So I just want to ask, out of this 121 work, where is there really address for practicing musicians or for general audience?
As I said, the 4 functions. Shiksha Granthas, etc. Those who have, had a manual aspect, we are catering to that need.
Dr. Ranade, would you like to suggest some reasons why you have felt, why Indian musicology has based itself on grammar and concentrated on grammar rather than on history? Some sociological reasons maybe. Why, or you will tell us that tomorrow. And the other thing which I glean from your writings itself, that music is has the literary threads, literature traditions poetic traditions. So if we give, if we study these traditions, maybe we get a historical perspective of music, and we could thus go into history of music, and rather than
yes, tomorrow the historical aspect and what we really make out of historical approach. I will talk about that tomorrow. These are related. The earlier one, I am suggesting that we had a grammatical bias which was left. We are not grammatical enough. Because grammar as it is understood today is only understood as yes and no, or right and wrong. That's not what grammar is. That's why, I gave you those 8 characteristics of grammar which were envisioned by Vararuchi. And I said these are the functions of a true grammar, and these should be and partly are functions of musicology. Some of them are seen in some texts, some of them are not. So I would suggest that we have to be truly grammatical and we have to understand the true thrust of grammar.
You talked of preservation.
Yeah.
How is it that notation did not receive enough attention in Indian music? If there is this idea of preserving, is important.
Yeah. No, I feel that comes from the perception of efficacy of oral tradition that we have. In oral tradition, as you know, there was a kind of notation which was a gestural notation. In addition to that, some marks on paper.
But not developed.
Not developed, because we never felt a necessity of doing it. And I am not saying that notation has no strong points. But at the same time, I am saying that, when, as I said, the nationalist spirit, it's very interesting that the moment people started writing on music, I have a list, data collected somewhere, 2 kinds of books were brought out. One had an annual aspect. The second was anthology aspect. Because every musician said, no, I have enough material, so I must bring it out. Then how to bring it out? So every person started to have his own notation system. In the early part of the 19th century and 20th century, you will see that every musician worth the name had his own notation system and brought out books in that. Whether it was Maula Baksh, whether it is Surendra Mohan Tagore, Bhatkhande, Balakrishna Bua, Vishnu Digambar, you name the musician, he has a book, Abdul Karim Khan Sahab. Everybody brought out a book and had his own notation system. Because they felt that if the Westerners have a notation system, we must have it. And there was another quarrel, people went on saying that our music can never be reduced to notation. And then they realized that they are talking of notation as a skeletal notation of the basic composition, not of elaboration. Then people started writing books of elaboration too, right from Vishnu Digambar, Yaman Kalyan, Kalyan Ala, all the elaborations written down. I had seen a musical concert of, I think, Malini Joshi or somewhere, who was a disciple of Yashwant Bua Mirashi, who sang a whole half-an-hour concert from the notebook where every alap was written down. And I felt that, well, it was an experiment. She herself must have felt that this is not lively enough, whatever it is. So this attempt of having notation systems was taken up on a large scale, and now people realize again that, well, notation has a skeletal importance. And now if you have pre-composed music, which you are getting a lot of it today, because people are really going in for recitals, not for concerts. They recite what they have practiced. They don't create on the stage. So these are the recitals that we have. So now they can be notated because everything is pre-composed.
If you look at psychology, the present day psychologists do not they do not hesitate to admit that a large part of human brain is still in dark, that we do not know. In fact, they say we use words emotion that describe emotion without really knowing what we mean by it. Now, since music has something direct to do with it, emotion, so it appears that scientific inquiry, in the sense in which we use it for physics and biology, it simply cannot work on music because it still is a hidden word. Well, I mean, the inquiries are going, but they, I mean, in a recent, film we saw, the psychologist said that it might take at least about 50 years before we can point out at what happens in the brain when we talk of anxiety. But we go about using these words, and same is true for words like consciousness, loudly. So, how would you react to that?
Yeah, I feel that, one has to accept the fact that if you have a long performing tradition, then you have to take performance as an accepted hypothesis and don't have to begin from the scratch. For example, if people are saying that Yogya is Karuna Rasa, accept that as a hypothesis and then work on it. Then you will realize that perhaps, this is only a hypothesis limited to a confined group of culture. Otherwise, if musically, intrinsically is nothing to do, you may realize that too. But the point is that we have some assumptions which have been practiced, which have been taught to us, and which are part of a performing tradition. We let us accept them.
With no liberty to question the hypothesis?
Of course. You have to say that. In fact, RC, all the time I'm only questioning.
So one question about the melodic codification of the raga forms. Are you going to deal with this tomorrow, or would you like to comment on the whole utility and the value of codification of the raga form from time to time?
I don't think that will come in my tomorrow's
Would you like to express your views on this?
Perhaps, then tomorrow, because
Modification too late in the evening is not very conducive to comfort.
Doctor, there are some chitra prabandhas in the old scriptures where it is form of a picture where the swaras are given. Are they obsolete or are they still can be sung? Because they are codified. There is a notation is there, and the notation is given in the form of a picture. They form a picture. So they can practically be sung? Then the grammar is already there.
yes, I feel this has more to do with the tradition where we wanted to establish correspondences between the graphic aspect, the visual aspect and the audio aspect. For example, we are all aware that Kalpasudras began this tradition. They started saying that Sa, Re have a particular graphic to go with it. Then they started to have for Tans also. But they soon realized that there are so many variables in the practice that it's not possible and desirable to have this kind of equalization or correspondence. Then later on, this Chitra Prabandha etc. became only a practice of documenting the practice. And this you will find also in books of prosody, as well as tabla, mridanga everywhere. 1904, who is that Mridanga Sagar, author of Mridanga Sagar? A wonderful book, 1904. He gives you, as you know, Padma Bandha, Chitra Bandhas, and everything has been done in that. But that's not the aspect which attracts the performer, but he follows it because it helps you in visualization, helps you in comprehension, that's all. So it's a documentation, not exactly codification.
Well, thank you so much for attending. I do hope all will come tomorrow. Thank you so much.